All right, everyone, we have some French election results coming in, and it looks like Le Pen has definitely lost. She's down around 35% right now, which is about where the polls put her in the final tally. She may rise up or drop a couple of points, and that, by the way, is critical. If when all the votes are counted, she's still above, 34, 35%, that's all she needed to do. That's the proper marker for the growth of Euroscepticism within France. If she drops some below like 33 or so, below a third, then you have to worry that Front National and indeed the Eurosceptic populist sentiments in France are actually weaker than predicted. And if she rises up above 40, which I wouldn't expect, that would be really good news for her, and it would mean next time around she'd obliterate whoever her opponent is if she gets above that mark in the final tally. But are you surprised? Some of you probably are. I had people claiming that Le Pen was a shoo-in on this channel for some months before the election. And what did I say? This is not like the U.S. election, and Le Pen is at a disadvantage. She had maybe, at her peak, she had maybe a 25% chance of winning. Because I saw something that some of you didn't. You wanted to draw a comparison, and indeed some Eurosceptics and even some of the establishment there that didn't like her wanted to draw a comparison between the French election, the fact that you had an anti-globalist candidate, a populist candidate, who was behind in the polling, who was called sort of, Nazi bigot and so forth. People wanted to draw a comparison between Le Pen and Trump thus, because those things seem similar. But if you looked at French polling, it was totally different. All French polling firms virtually agreed with one another within a scope of maybe 5 points throughout the entire fucking election, both for the first ballot and for the second ballot. That is completely different from what we saw in U.S. polling. In U.S. polling, we had several firms that systemically estimated Trump's chances within states and at the national level as being substantially higher than the rest of the polling firms. What then remained was to determine, based on the polling methodology and so forth, which of these groups were probably closer to the truth. I went for YouGov and Rasmussen. Rasmussen against my own instincts, by the way. YouGov I trust more. And I said if I look at their methodology, they're not skewing their numbers, they're taking more randomized samples, whereas these other groups are overestimating support for Hillary Clinton based on an expectation of higher turnout among traditionally Democratic groups and a higher overall amount of approval based on the sampling methodology, literally sampling more women than men, assuming their turnout, I guess, is higher, sampling more minorities than are in the general population, especially within the Rust Belt. That never made sense. He was always above their estimates and would have been even, by the way, if YouGov had been wrong, and he still, at that point, may or may not have even won because the voting was so close in places like Florida, in North Carolina, certainly in Michigan and Wisconsin and these other places. He could have just as easily lost these states if turnout for him had been half a point lower. And so it wasn't the same as the French polling. Additionally, the gap was a lot larger. Even those firms like MSNBC and CNN that estimate, oh yeah, he's behind by 8 points in Michigan, they never had a gap anything close to 20 points. And it looks like the real gap is slightly larger than that, ultimately. The gap being much larger, you have to assume a much, much higher degree of fudging in the polls. And you'd have to apply to every single polling firm in order to have imagined a scenario in which Le Pen actually won. Now, I said chances were very low that Le Pen won the election, and I was right yet again. Macron has been projected as the winner. That will probably remain stable. If she climbs to 40 in the final polling, great red letter day for her, because that's the other component. It doesn't matter if Macron wins. It doesn't matter if any globalist candidate in the EU at this point wins. Brexit has already occurred. The fracturing has already begun. That is simply the foreshock to greater things to come. It might very well start in Eastern Europe before it starts in a place like France or Sweden or Germany or something like that. If you look at Germany, AfD is, I think, in third or fourth place. Their candidate has stood down there, Pietri or whatever her name is. They've had problems as a party. An alternative for Deutschland. Alternative for Germany. Sieg Heil, I guess. It might start in Eastern Europe, honestly, over the immigration question. But here's the thing. All you have to ask yourself is this. With the EU already under stress, can you envision a scenario in which a post-national authority is capable of appeasing all of its member states, when their economies and their cultures are vastly different? The answer is no, because any decision they make, whether it's fiscal, whether it's social, whether it's related to military endeavors, will inevitably piss off the populations of at least half of its member states. That's why the EU is doomed. It has to inevitably adopt this weird, centrist-style mixed model that doesn't work ultimately for anyone and slowly grinds down its own capability to function. Euroscepticism in France is far higher than it was a few years ago. Euroscepticism is growing in literally every part of Europe. There is no corner of Europe, no corner of the European Union where approval of the European Union is rising right now. It is already doomed. Macron winning and saying, oh yeah, we're not going to address the question of, leaving the European Union or something like that, eerily resembles maybe the UK a decade ago. At most, the EU probably has a decade left in its own survival. It might not even have that long. If it's really lucky, they might straggle on in some form for 15 or 20 years and then collapse. By the way, the boogeyman of Russia, as Russia's economy slowly crumbles back into the rust bin of history, is going to become less and less of a fixation for the people of Europe. Around the same time that the EU said, oh, well, Russia's got an economy the size of Italy, haha, they're so weak, they began to cheapen their own arguments. Now it doesn't make so much sense for them anymore. Macron and his people tried to blame the Russians for the latest batch of leaks for him. He's almost a lame duck the second he takes office, rocked by scandal on day one of his leadership of the nation of France. Do you envision great things for him? This gap isn't overly large, by the way. The fact is, a lot of these people who were Eurosceptics probably voted against Le Pen for her fiscal policies. Maybe she should consider reformulating them, by the way. But the EU is incapable of addressing the issues that are leading to the rise of the far left and the far right. The next time around, there may not be a Macron. It might be a far left candidate versus a populist, a far right candidate, socially or fiscally speaking. This is what we've already seen this in Austria. Van der Bellen's Green Party, far left, versus Hofer, far right populist, nativist, former Teutonic Party. There was no center. It didn't even make it to the election. It didn't exist. We look at what happened in the Netherlands. The main party lost its main centrist ally within its coalition, had to ally with the far left. Now they have to deal with that for years at a time. Wilders' party, meanwhile, gains some dominance. You look at Sweden. You've got the rise of a dedicated party. It's literally the feminist party. Another main party, the Swedish Democrats, which is like populism light after a fashion. You look at the UK. Where's Labour? They don't really exist. You've got nationalism rocking Scotland. They're far left nationalists, but they're still Scottish nationalists. And then you've got an upswelling of people within the conservative movement who are further right than they were in the past, have no problem with like the Brexit stuff. They're Eurosceptics. This is happening all over Europe. The European Union, the European model's already doomed. You ask people in Europe, are you a European or are you like Polish, Irish, whatever? And I'm going to say, oh, I'm a European. Nobody has any civic pride in the concept of the European Union. They see it as a matter of convenience, and it's becoming less and less convenient for people. Mass immigration has pissed off nations where the society there doesn't like such things. Austerity pisses off some nations. Leftist policies piss off other nations. Bureaucracy. It's inevitable. It doesn't work. It doesn't matter if Macron wins. There probably won't be a European Union functioning for him to appease in the future. So who cares? They're already doomed. So don't lose hope on France. Some people were also saying, oh, if Le Pen doesn't win, France is doomed. Oh, they'll die off as a culture. They're not going to die off as a culture. There's still majority French within France. I know it may not seem like that. Sure, if you go visit Paris, probably not the case. But you go to the outlands of like rural French society, yeah, it's still French people. So fucking what? Who cares? Even Varg's telling you, oh, don't bother voting for Le Pen. It doesn't even matter, ultimately. Globalism has already died. Largely in the world. It's probably been dealt a mortal blow now. Now all we have to do is wait and see how long it takes to keel over. You smash your enemy in the head. They're still staggering around. It looks like they're still kind of alive and awake. You're just waiting for gravity to take its toll. on their largely lifeless form. The European Union is doomed. Their model doesn't work. Globalism's untenable. Globalism doesn't work anymore. You can see a faster moving microcosm of globalism within the EU. The same facets of economics and society and military endeavors there that contribute to the EU being a non-working, strangulated system are also strangulating globalism as we speak. That's why there's such an uprising of both the far left and the far right. Ultimately, when you look at groups on the far, like Anticom or something, and then you look at like some of the far left, not Antifa because they're globalists, but if you look at some of the far left groups rising up around the world, they're fundamentally fighting the same enemy. Things are the death of the center is the precursor to both good and bad things to come. Overhauling the world order may be very messy. It may be very bloody, unfortunately. Ultimately, we can at least look forward to enough change to ensure the possibility of a good future for ourselves and for our children. And that it doesn't matter what part of the world you're in. It doesn't matter what your race is, what your economic background is. We can't do anything to save ourselves, to improve our lives under globalism any more than any European can under the EU's model. It's basically miniaturized globalism. It doesn't work. It doesn't appease anyone. When the EU straddles that tightrope, straddles that very thin line between the left and the right on any issue in order to appease people and not piss them off too much, it ends up doing a little bit of pissing off to everybody. The far right sees it as socialist. The far left sees it as like fascism. That's what happens within the EU. It's what happens anytime that a nation tries to do this shit. The EU's not even an empire. They're making the same mistakes that actual empires made before, and they're not going to last nearly as long as Rome or something like that by endorsing the same failed kind of model that was used in antiquity. Never worked before, never will work in the future. They'll end up destroying themselves. They will literally strangle themselves at the EU level. So I'm not concerned about it. It was almost a conclusion already that Le Pen was going to lose. It's not surprising. I said that she had very little chance. In order to envision her having a chance to win, you needed systemic and massive polling bias and probably at the same time a massive turnout differential. One or the other, yeah, I can grant you. It made sense to say, okay, well, maybe Le Pen's supporters, they're just more energized. A lot of these people stay at home, don't bother to vote for Macron. Or, yeah, all these polling firms are wrong. They're underestimating some group within France. She's actually a few points ahead of this. But 20 points? So you need a 10-point skew in both of these aspects or something approximating that? Yeah, that was probably not going to happen. And that's just the way it is. So for people in France that are against globalism, that are against being abused by the EU, don't worry too much. You need to organize and tell people about Euroscepticism and try to get a Frexit referendum going, with or without Front National. I mean, you'll have their backing certainly as a party, but you don't need Le Pen in power to push that as an issue. Simply frame it as a sovereignty debate. People should have a choice. People who weren't born when the EU was already there. They never got a say in the matter. Now there are several whole new generations that never did get a say. We should have our say. We're the youth. We're cool and stuff like that. Frame it like they did with the Brexit. Just do that and try to get a vote going. And even if you fail then, it doesn't matter. It shows at least you have the wherewithal to support your sovereignty. It will draw the globalists out. They'll have to call you Nazis. They'll have to call you deplorables and things like that. And Macron's not really a threat. Yeah, of course he'll push for the Islamization of France and of Europe in general. They've been doing that anyway. It didn't take Macron to do that. Hollande was doing that, and David Cameron and all these other people, these, multiculturalists, Angela Merkel, who claims to be like center-right or something like that. It's like, it's insane. So yeah, don't worry too much about the results of this election. Not going to be a problem within another decade or so. You just watch. Now, there's my prediction right there. Watch what happens with the EU. See if it goes into a nice, shining, happy, rainbow-filled land of paradise, or that friggin' collapses in under its own weight. That's about all. Peace out.